Hello, everyone. I'm Selby Kiffer, the Senior International Specialist for Books and Manuscripts at Sotheby's. And I'm here at Sotheby's York Avenue in New York, where it's just past noon. So good afternoon to those of you joining us on the East Coast. Good morning to those of you further west. But we're very happy to have you here for a discussion about some selected items from the very, very collection of Barbara and Ira Lipman. I'm joined today by three of my colleagues, Richard Austin, the head of our department, and two of our specialists, Ella Hall and Kalika Sands. And we'll be discussing, each of us, a different aspect of the Lipman collection. I should say the Lipman collection of books and manuscripts, because Mr. and Mrs. Lipman collected in a wide variety of areas. And I think today what we'll be speaking about may be a surprise to some of you who, like us, were familiar with Mr. Lipman in particular, because Ira Lipman was noted as a great patriot and a great collector of American history, both printed and manuscript. And in the new year, in fact, we will be offering for sale his astounding collection of Americana. But today we're here to talk about some of his other materials. He collected in a wide variety of books and manuscripts, from great highlights of human thought to science to literature, children's books, and I'm even going to be discussing baseball in some depth. We'll be talking for about 45 minutes, and at the end of that time, we'll answer some questions. If any of you have any, you can submit your questions at any time. Beginning now, there should be a little underneath your video screen. You'll see a web form where you can enter your name and your question, and we'll get to those in about 3/4 of an hour. This section of the Littman Library is being offered in an online sale, currently live on SOTHEBY'S.com, and running through the 16th of December, a week from tomorrow. At 2 o'clock on the 16th, the lots will begin to close in 1 minute intervals sequentially, and you can bid anytime from right now till just before the bidding closes. And in fact, you can even keep bidding beyond that, because if bid received with a minute or less remaining in the time allotted to that lot, we'll have another minute added to it. So you don't have to worry about being sniped at the end if there's something that you just have to have. From the 12th, that is this Saturday, through next Tuesday, the 18th, we'll have an exhibition open. Because of COVID restrictions, it is by appointment, but we'd be happy to see any of you here. If you can't make it during the exhibition period, we'd be very happy to make a private viewing with you. And you can reach us at 212-606-7385 for the book department, or just email us at books@sotheby's.com. So I think I'll get started. I mentioned baseball. Of course, there's lots of great books about baseball. There's lots of great baseball players. So one item that combines both of those is Babe Ruth's own book. I think we have some, there we go. Babe Ruth's own book of baseball. This was a limited edition of 1,000 copies signed by Ruth. This was before there was wide trafficking in baseball memorabilia, and if you're looking for an authenticated Babe Ruth signature, this is a good place to start. Of course, this book appeals to people beyond the realm of baseball. We've estimated that this copy will sell for between $6,000 and $8,000. It's illustrated with photographs of the time. This was published in 1928, and it gives, of course, it was largely ghost-written, as even today's sports biographies tend to be, but nonetheless, it gives some interesting insights, and it's a great starting place for someone who's interested in expanding their sporting collection. Very often, in bibliographical terms, sports means very traditional sports. Fishing, hunting, tennis, golf. So it's nice to see baseball included as well. Going back almost a century earlier, another item in the Littman sale is Robin Carver's Book of Sports. And a little bit later, Kalika Sands will be discussing some of the children's books in the Littman collection. And Carver's Book of Sports certainly qualifies on that score. It's illustrated with woodcut vignettes, and it gives the rules and history of a number of children's games. But most interesting for us, it includes the first appearance in America of rules of baseball, or at least an early predecessor of baseball, and has this wonderful woodcut image that you can see on your screen now of children playing ball on the Boston Common. It's been called one of the crown jewels of early baseball books, and combines a couple of the Littman's interests, baseball and children's books. Not all collectible books are grand looking items. You can see this is rather modest in appearance, but this is a nice copy. It's in the original cloth, has the original applique illustration on the front cover, and it does have that terrific illustration of early baseball, as well as many other vignettes throughout. We tried to make it all American, but they snuck in a picture of cricket. What can you do? A great name in all American sport is Albert Spalding. I can't believe that there's anyone watching who at one time hasn't held a product of the Spalding company in their hand, whether it was a baseball bat, a tennis ball, a racket, soccer ball. Spalding makes it all. But Spalding was, in fact, an early baseball player before he became a business magnate, and he published this early history of baseball, which he called America's National Game, in 1911. This is a presentation copy. You're looking at the front cover, where Uncle Sam looks ready to step into the batter's box there. Very serious look on his face. And the front free end paper, which Spalding has inscribed to J.F. Gray with his compliments in the year of publication, 1911. This is an interesting book, and it's an interesting title that he calls it the National Game. Of course, it's largely debunked now that baseball was invented at Cooperstown, New York, by Doubleday. But Spalding is a great believer and great pusher in that idea, because he did not want baseball to have any roots in England or English games like cricket, as we just saw that Carver was acknowledging to some extent or other. So this is not a terribly scarce book, but it's somewhat unusual to find it inscribed, and particularly inscribed in the year of publication. Let me get it here. The condition is really fantastic. I mean, this is when books were made well. And when you go to your local bookshop and you pick up a modern biography and you see the binding is boards and it's glued in, this is cloth, brilliant stamping, very well preserved, and estimated at just $1,500 to $2,000. But if you collect baseball, you can't limit yourself just to books, and Ira Lipman did not. What we've seen so far, except for the Babe Ruth book, I suppose, is relatively generic, although Babe Ruth is baseball. But Babe Ruth was also a Yankee, and Ira Lipman was a passionate Yankees fan. I think that's partly because he grew up in the South, but before there were any major league teams in the South. And the Yankees were a national brand even then, and he started to follow them and followed them faithfully throughout. I think a lot of kids get their love of baseball from their parents, and Mr. Littman used to travel with his father in their business, and I know that they attended at least one game in St. Louis where Ira, as a young boy, was able to get the autograph of Stan Musial, which he treasured. But I was looking for a graphic of a Babe Ruth baseball card, and I'm sure we'll have it for you in just a moment. So this is a Gowdy baseball card from 1933. It's a number 44 Babe Ruth. It's one of 4 Babe Ruth cards that Gowdy issued that year. And it was the very first year that the Gowdy company, which wasn't a baseball card manufacturer, it was a gum company. But it was the very first year that they included baseball cards with their gum. And these are thought to be some of the most important, most striking baseball cards ever made. This has been graded by PSA as a mint 9. So we can say there is no better example of this card in existence, or at least known. Only 3 other cards have reached the same grade of 9. No 10s exist. And so you know you're getting an unequaled card if you add this to your collection. Now, of course, that comes at a certain premium. We've looked at things so far that are relatively modestly estimated, but our pre-sale estimate for the 1933 Gowdy 144 mint 9, $300,000 to $500,000. So that's another way, I think, of showing that Mr. Littman loved baseball, because he could have gotten some nice books and manuscripts for what he paid for that card. But he loved the card. He loved the Yankees. Babe Ruth shows up throughout his collection, and in one of the great items, and it's maybe my favorite baseball item in the collection, is a ball from the 1939 Hall of Fame induction ceremony. Now, the first class of the Hall of Fame was elected in 1936, but there was no official ceremony where the inductees went to Cooperstown until 1939. And this ball is signed by every player living who had been inducted into the Hall of Fame up until 1939, with the single exception of Tris Speaker, the great outfielder, whose, I believe his glove was nicknamed "The Place Triples Go to Die." But this ball is signed by Babe Ruth, Connie Mack, Honus Wagner. Special shout out there because I am a Pittsburgh Pirates fan and I don't have a lot to cheer about. Cy Young, Ty Cobb, George Sisler, Larry LaJoie, also known as Knapp, Walter Johnson, Grover Cleveland Alexander, Eddie Collins, Lefty Grove, and Dizzy Dean. The last 2 were not members of the Hall of Fame at the time they signed this ball. They were in Cooperstown to play in an exhibition game. But of course, they both were duly and appropriately elected. I think that's one of the troubles of being on York Avenue in Manhattan, a little background traffic noise, perhaps. This was purchased by Mr. Littman at a Sotheby's sale in 1991, the legendary Copeland collection, which was one of the baseball collections that really kick-started the still going, hate to say mania, but I'll say it, mania for baseball and everything related to it. One last thing before I'll pass it on to my colleagues who are probably itchy to get started, is a album of the 1931 New York Yankees, signed by 19 members of the team, including, get this, on one team, 10 future members of the Hall of Fame. This album was put together by one of the coaches, James Burke, and you'll see he has his Super Libros, which is just a fancy way of saying he has his name on the front cover of the album. And inside are individual photographs taken by one of the most renowned uh, photographers of baseball in history also named George Burke, but of no relation to Jimmy. And you can see perhaps his card is here. And there are these beautiful silver prints. There's Joe McCarthy, the manager of the team. Some signed to Jimmy, some simply signed, but 10 Hall of Famers, including Lou Gehrig and, of course, Babe Ruth. Now, for a more traditional perspective on the Littmans book collecting, I'm going to ask Richard to take over, and I think he'll be speaking about some more familiar books. Richard?
Thanks, Selby. I'm actually not a baseball fan, but after looking at those lots, I might become a baseball fan. I'm speaking about some of the high spots in the Littman collection. And as Selby said earlier, they didn't just collect Americana. They collected across many categories. And some of the items I'm going to be speaking about do have an American slant to them. But the first one is certainly a book that needs no introduction. It's been called the most important single work in science. It is Darwin's Theory of Evolution, the origin of species by the means of natural selection. It's said that every modern discussion of man and the universe and man's place in the universe rests on Darwin. Now, this is a work that Darwin worked on for decades, and it was actually quite surprising when you see the book itself, going to be much longer. But he decided to aim it at a popular audience. He stripped out a lot of the scientific jargon, didn't want it just for specialists or professors or scientists, but directly for the reading public. The first printing was 1,250 copies. The publisher, John Murray, actually had orders for 1,500. 500 of those copies were to go to circulating libraries. It was a bestseller immediately. 3,000 more were quickly printed. Because of the fury that it invoked in its reviews, not just from the religious community, but from the scientific community, it became a book that everyone wanted to read. Now, Darwin eventually produced 6 editions of the book. The science, of course, became accepted in the next few decades. The religious controversy still continues. But when you're looking at a book that is so popular as this one, what are you looking for if you want a collectible copy? As I mentioned before, the book has great bulk to it. It means that the hinges are often cracked. It's often soiled and worn. One of the great things about 19th century publishing is you have the gilt, the title and gilt on the spine. You'd like to see that nice and bright, just as we have here. Again, this is a very attractive copy of a book that's often found in much less attractive condition. The next work I'd like to talk about is a work that actually influenced Darwin, strangely enough. It's Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. It is something that when Darwin was thinking about his scientific theories, he thought about economic theories as well. Just as he saw a division of labor and nature, there was a division of labor in economics as well. In fact, by observing some of the workers in a Wedgwood factory, he came up with the idea of niche specializations and how those both best adapted in their chosen field would survive. This is called the first and greatest classic of modern economic thought. It's Smith's major expression of the theory of free markets. Smith's ideas on individual liberty and accumulation of wealth, a system of natural liberty and justice which strives toward the improvement of the living standards of the population at large, equating higher wages with healthier and a more productive workforce. He set out that the limits of economic growth are not bound by economics, but politically. Of course, he was against tariffs, and this is something that was of great interest to the new American colonies. It's often said that if his theories on modern capitalism were followed, the American Revolution might not have taken place. I find it actually interesting myself that the first American edition of this book was published in 1789, the year that George Washington was inaugurated. It was a major influence in the American colonies. Jefferson in particular was a great fan of the book, recommending it to many of his friends. In fact, he said, in political economy, I think Smith's Wealth of Nations is the best book in existence. It sold out in 6 months. There were 6 other editions in his lifetime. So what are you looking for when you're looking for a good copy of this book? Usually you would want it in a contemporary binding. But the problem sometimes with the contemporary binding is they can be worn. And if you're not used to collecting books, you can sometimes be a little bit nervous about handling them. This copy is in a very handsome bound to style, meaning that it's in the style of an 18th century binding. In fact, if you were to look at this book from a distance, it'd be very difficult to tell it wasn't an 18th century binding. And as you handle it through the years, as time goes on, it's going to be increasingly just like an 18th century binding by the time you get wear on it. You look inside, one of the things you would like from an 18th century book as well is to be free from foxing. This is a nice, fresh, bright copy. And again, this is something, one of the books we encourage you to come in and see in our galleries, make an appointment. Everything is available for viewing. I'd like to move on to a much more American book. I don't think it gets much more American than Leaves of Grass. Actually, Leaves of Grass was the only work of literature included in the enormously influential 1963 exhibition, Printing in the Mind of Man, which really defined high spot collecting. Whitman's production of this book was very much an American enterprise. In short, Whitman did it himself. Not only did he write the poems, he designed the binding. He even set much of the type for the book. Of the 95 pages, I believe 10 pages were actually set in, he set the type on a small hand press just across the river here in Brooklyn. If you look here, one of the things that I find most interesting about Whitman as an author was he was one of the first celebrity authors. From the beginning, he was very involved with how he appeared to the public. As time went on, you see signed cabinet cards from Whitman. In fact, we have one of those in the sale coming up. But this is a very famous frontispiece. There's an image of Whitman, and he doesn't look like your standard author. In fact, he looks like really what he describes himself as, a loafer, very much a common man. And that's something, of course, an image that he strived to project. Usually in many copies of this book, this is very foxed, it's very brown, but here you have the portrait of Whitman, nice and bright. Indeed, the entire this book itself is very nice and bright. We talked about the gilt on the Darwin before. Here you can see this is the first issue of the book in which the stamping is in gilt, the title is in gilt. Now, Whitman paid for this book himself, and he didn't have very much money. The first issue of the book was produced in less than 800 copies, maybe 337 were in this first issue binding. And this is really what you're looking for, is the first issue binding. Now, when this book first came out, it contained 12 untitled poems. It was not something a major publisher was interested in issuing. 12 very strange untitled poems. But of course, it was revised throughout his life. And by the time the deathbed edition of 1892, Leaves of Grass had expanded to over 400 poems. In keeping with American literature, one of the great high spots is Moby Dick. Now, this is originally titled The Whale for its first English edition in 1851. Melville changed it to Moby Dick. The next month, it was issued in a one-volume edition, as you see here, by Harpers and Brothers. There were about 3,000 copies of this book printed, and it sold really well at first. 1,500 copies were sold in less than 2 weeks. But then sales, they dramatically dropped off, and less than 300 copies were sold in the next 2 years. Most of the other copies went to a warehouse where they were destroyed in a fire in 1853. What this means is that there's not very many collectible copies of the book that are available. And it's also a book that very much suffers from what a lot of 19th century American publishing suffered from, which is cheap printing practices, cheap paper. And also, it's hard to believe today, but Melville was sort of forgotten about. It wasn't really until the 1920s when his reputation, there was a critical reevaluation of his work. So for a long time, he was very much a forgotten author. And what that means is that during that period, books weren't saved. The other books that I've mentioned here, they were bestsellers from the start. They were seen as important, upon their publication. Therefore, it might be seen that more collectible copies of those works survive. So you have to be a little more forgiving when you're looking for a copy of Moby Dick. And by that, I mean the cloth is normally going to be worn. The gilt will be worn. It could be shaken. It could be foxed. But here, once again, you have a very attractive example. Now, it might be difficult to see on screen, but there's just a little bit of restoration at the ends. But the gilt remains bright. And most importantly, the interior of the book, as I said, a lot of the 19th century American publishing, the paper was cheap, it would fox, it would brown. There's just a little bit of browning in this book, but it's in much, much better condition than you would normally see it. One of the great things about Melville when there was a reemergence in the 1920s And perhaps the work that really brought him to a really wide reading public was the 1930 publication of Rockwell Kent's illustrated edition of Moby Dick. And Kent spent months going to whaling museums, reading additionally in whaling literature. His very modernist take on illustrating the stark black and white ink wash drawings, they were perfectly suited to the psychological impact of the story, and also for the vibrant action and the nautical action that took place. This was seen as a landmark in historic book and modernist book design, certainly. It's a work personally I believe has influenced a lot of graphic novels. And because the work comes in 3 volumes, it also comes in a very special case, which I'd like to show you, which is an aluminum slipcase. Now this is very unusual, but it does give the book its nickname, which is The Whale in a Can. So for book collectors, when you hear that I just bought a whale in a can, you know it's a Rockwell Kent 1930 illustrated Moby Dick. I'd like to turn it over now to my colleague, specialist Ella Hall, to continue talking about American literature.
Thank you so much, Richard. My name is Ella Hall. I'm a specialist here in the Books and Manuscripts department at Sotheby's. And today I'll be kind of filling out a discussion of American literature for the Littman collection. Richard had touched on some high points in this area, including Whitman's splendid Leaves of Grass. So I'll take that as a jumping off point and begin my portion by discussing another famous transcendentalist work, a first edition of Henry David Thoreau's Walden, which is lot 117 in our sale. It's estimated at $6,000 to $8,000. So Walden was Thoreau's second work following A Week in the Concord and was first published in Boston in 1854. This is one of just 2,000 copies of the first edition that were printed, and it's a particularly nice example of this work. As Richard touched upon, each publication has its own unique concerns regarding condition and fragility, and Walden is no exception. It's, you're looking for sort of similar aspects of the gilding on the spine being particularly bright, wear to the extremities, foxing to the text block. And when handling other examples, you'll often encounter more significant wear. So we're very pleased to have the chance to handle such a nice example of this work. This copy was issued without the publisher's advertisement, sometimes found at the back, but the consensus is that there's no established priority between a copy with, say, May ads, October ads, or no ads at all. I think the idea of an experiment in living simply feels particularly resonant in this moment. So perhaps in light of these exceptional circumstances, you'll forgive my reciting one of the most oft quoted portions of this work. Thoreau writes in the second chapter titled Where I Lived and What I Lived For, quote, "I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. I did not wish to live what was not life. Living is so dear. Nor did I wish to practice resignation, unless it was quite necessary. I wanted to live deep and suck out all the marrow of life, to live so sturdily and Spartan-like as to put to rout all that was not life, to cut a broad swath and shave close, to drive life into a corner and reduce it to its lowest terms. And if it proved to be mean, why then to get the whole and genuine meanness of it and publish its meanness to the world. Or if it were sublime, to know it by experience and be able to give a true account of it in my next excursion." So this is certainly one of the most famous sections of this work, and I doubt it's new to our viewers today, but I think it really speaks to the continued resonance of works like this and why collectors continue to find meaning in surrounding themselves with the words of authors like Thoreau. But even Spartan living has its limits, and in the next lot, we'll see Thoreau's constructive solitude give way to sociability, just as we all hope our lives soon will. So I have here one component of lot 119, which is a collection of association copies from the collection of Theo Brown and his wife, Sarah Brown. So this lot is comprised of first editions of Excursions, Cape Cod, A Yankee in Canada, inscribed by Thoreau's sister, Sophia Elizabeth Thoreau, Early Spring in Massachusetts, and Summer, both of which are inscribed by his associate, Harrison Gray Otis Blake. Blake was a close friend of Thoreau's, and he would later be chosen by Thoreau's sister to edit his friend's journals for posthumous publication. After Thoreau's death in 1862, Sophia safeguarded his enormous manuscript journal from the publishing designs of several aspirants, but upon her death in 1876, she entrusted those notebooks and the extensive additional papers to Blake, whom she regarded as one of Thoreau's most loyal and sympathetic friends. So on the receiving end of Blake's inscriptions was Sarah Brown, the widow of Theophilus Brown, a Worcester, Massachusetts tailor whose humor and charm attracted the city's intellectuals to his shop and earned him the nickname the Wit of Worcester. Brown had met Thoreau through their mutual friend Blake in 1849, the year he published A Week on the Concord, also at his own expense, perhaps a fine American tradition of, pull up by your bootstraps and get it done yourself. So quoting here from a 19th century newspaper account of their little cabal, in the back window of Theo Brown's tailoring shop on the corner of Main and Pearl Streets, where many a hard-fought battle of chess had been won and lost, anon was wont to sit the philosopher Thoreau, fashioning the habiliments of the soul, while near him Theo would calmly continue cutting out the habiliments for the wear of the body, and Harry Blake, with his eyes glistening with delight behind his gold-bowed glasses, would follow the arguments of each. So here we have the inscription to Sarah from Blake. I'm quite fond of this little group because I think it's illustrative of a different approach to collecting, where we've been emphasizing the condition of the previous lots. Here, the value is really in the associations reflected in these inscriptions. So you have Thoreau, where it all originates. You have his sister Sophia, who safeguarded his legacy. You have Harry Blake, the editor to whom it was eventually entrusted to do so. And finally, the Browns, the recipients and associates at the center of this particular web. And one final element is the hand of the collector themselves. So visible here with the book plate of the noted bibliophile James Copley in each volume. So there are so many relational threads to pull at here, and they're all collapsed into one small stack of octavos. So continuing on to another cornerstone of American literature, I have here Lot 26, which is printing of the American edition of Samuel Clemens' The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, which is estimated at $18,000 to $25,000. The English edition actually preceded the American edition by about 6 months, but the latter is generally considered to be the authoritative version, breaking the general rule of primacy in collecting priority. In this case, Clemens, being American himself, buoys the importance of the American imprint, but the American edition was also the first to include illustrations, and Twain was more closely involved with the revision of the proofs of the American edition. Just as an interesting aside, it also was one of the first novels to be written on a typewriter, which became commercially available in the year before its publication. This is another nice example in the original gilt-stamped publisher's binding. This particular copy has an early Christmas inscription, which is very timely, which is from the year of its publication, in fact. It also includes a book plate on the paste down here. Perhaps this will serve as inspiration for those who are currently juggling holiday gift lists, myself included. I'm sure I'm biased, but I always think a good book makes for a great gift. So this is what we call an unsophisticated copy, which for the uninitiated is not a slight, but rather means there have not been any interventions or repairs over the book's long life, which is something I would hope to say at almost 150 years of age. It's usually found in worn or more soiled states. So this is yet another example of a very nice survival. And finally, I'll talk about this book's natural pairing, Lot 29, which is the first edition of his subsequent work, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. So this copy is estimated at $15,000 to $20,000. It's also in the original in publisher's cloth. Other copies were issued simultaneously in sheep, half Morocco, or blue cloth with no priority. The prose in The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn really embodied a new kind of American vernacular, although its use of coarse language was somewhat controversial from the outset, a conversation that really continues to this day. Its initial reception was maybe not quite as effusive as one might expect, given how enduring of a work it is. Although Hemingway did later praise the novel in his characteristically bombastic fashion, saying, quote, all modern American literature comes from one book by Mark Twain called Huckleberry Finn. It's the best book we've had. All American writing comes from that. There was nothing before, and there has been nothing as good since. So there you have it. Interestingly, Sotheby's actually handled the authentication of the first half of the manuscript for Huck Finn in 1991, a project that I believe my colleague Selby was intimately involved in, so perhaps he'll have a few things to add at the conclusion. Twain had sent the second half of the manuscript to the Erie County Public Library in the 1880s at the solicitation of a benefactor, James Fraser Gluck. The rediscovered first half was found in an attic trunk by Gluck's granddaughter after being lost for more than a century. Interestingly, it varies widely from the published text. Each page of the notebook is filled with corrections, deletions, and additions in Twain's hand. The opening lines, for example, had been changed 3 times. He first wrote, "You will not know about me," which he then changed to, "You do not know about me," before arriving at the final version, "You don't know about me without you have read a book by the name of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, but that ain't no matter." So it's an incredibly important bibliographic discovery and shed some light on the development of the vernacular that makes this book so foundational to American literature. So thank you for listening along. And with that, I'm pleased to hand it over to my colleague, Dr. Kalika Sands.
All right, thank you so much, Ella. I'm really pleased today to be able to speak a little bit about some of the children's books that are in the collection, and hopefully I'll be able to pick up on some of the themes that my colleagues have already mentioned. One thing that I find particularly interesting about children's literature is that it changed pretty fundamentally in the 1840s. So prior to this point, the literature was primarily instructional. And then after the 1840s, there was a real sort of philosophical shift in what children's literature should do. So people became concerned with this idea of how children's imaginations worked and what their interior lives were like. And even people like Charles Darwin thought that if we could understand children better, we could understand adults better. So as a result of that, we start to see literature that really exemplifies the kind of lived experience of being a child, which I think is pretty special and pretty endearing and could help explain why so many titles from our youth really stick with us as adults. And I think another thing about children's literature, it's when we're young that our tastes start to form and that we really start to think about what collecting means. So the first book I'm going to be talking about is Louisa May Alcott's Little Women. And this, again, will pick up on some of the themes of transcendentalism that Ella spoke about, and I think is a classic that many of us have continued to love over the decades. So Alcott, as many people know, she was born in Pennsylvania, but she spent the majority of her life in Concord, Massachusetts. And she was surrounded by people like Thoreau and Emerson. I think Thoreau would even borrow tools from her father to work on his cabin, and Emerson would work closely with her father, Bronson Alcott, on his own writing and some of his transcendentalist philosophies. So much like Alcott's heroine, Jo March, she began writing stories to supply additional income for her family, and these were often published in pulp magazines of the day. So in this respect, Little Women serves as a stylistic departure. So we have a copy of the book here. As Ella mentioned, this would be considered an unsophisticated copy. Nothing has really been done to it since it was published in 1868. And as Richard mentioned, we have the publisher's original cloth. The gilt is still bright. You can see that on the spine as well. So this was published initially, 2,000 copies were issued, and they weren't quite sure how it was going to do. And at the end of it, I'm just going to read you a line. It says, "So grouped, the curtain falls upon Meg, Jo, Beth, and Amy. Whether it ever arises again depends upon the reception given to the first act of the domestic drama called Little Women." So Alcott and her publisher didn't need to worry at all. From the instant that it was published, it was wildly successful, and the printers struggled to keep up with demand. And I think quite heroically, really, Alcott was able to provide the manuscript for the second part, which we have here, in just about 3 months. So here we have the first edition in 2 parts. The volumes were published 1 year apart from each other. And it wasn't really until 1880 that these books were published in a single volume called Little Women. So I think, a really special thing kind of in the arc of children's literature and also in American literature. So moving on, I'm going to speak about Treasure Island, which I think is another text that probably many of us are familiar with from our childhood. And again, it kind of signals a next step in how children's literature was conceived. So we have Robert Louis Stevenson's great classic, and Stevenson, a great adventurer himself, within this is able to engender another world that a child or indeed an adult can really become absorbed in. And the thing about this first edition is that it really gives us our current day understanding of pirates, or how we conceptualize them. So it's the first time that we have a pirate with a wooden leg and a parrot sitting on his shoulder. It's also the first instance where we have the kind of idea of X marks the spot on a treasure map. I'm not sure if you can see this plate in the front, but there we have it, which is a very exciting thing. And just this concept of books being able to transport us to these other lands. Another thing that is unique about this first edition is that it was gifted by one of Stevenson's contemporaries, so the Victorian poet Algernon Charles Swinburne. And he gave this to the nephew of one of his friends, Theodore Watts Dunton. So Watts Dunton was a literary critic and a poet in his own right, and he really encouraged Swinburne, who was struggling with alcoholism, to try and change his ways, adopt a different lifestyle, and focus on his poetry. So that was a huge turning point in Swinburne's life, and so I think it's really quite special to have this first edition and to also have such a special inscription and association as well. And I think in recent years too, this is a text that has taken on more critical importance. So it's really viewed, in addition to kind of establishing the iconography of pirates, it's also this tale very much about sort of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, I think is something that several of us have mentioned today. So, moving on, I wanted to mention a children's classic that I think would be impossible sort of in this context not to talk about. So we have 4 volumes of Winnie the Pooh books that will be in a single lot. So it starts off with when we were very young. Then we have Winnie the Pooh. Sorry, I think these are a little bit shiny. Now We Are 6, and The House at Pooh Corner. So I think, as you are able to see, these are all in their original dust jackets. And when we open them up, we're able to see as well that the boards are quite decorative. So we have the original bindings. These are beautifully embossed with the characters from the tales. And in addition to this, each of the books is signed by Milne on the title page. So I'm not sure if you can quite see that. And that's another thing in terms of collectability. Obviously, the signature adds to its rarity, adds to its value. And I think with children's books more broadly, particularly as they progress from the 1840s onwards, and we start to have more of an engagement with image and text. So here we have Shepherd's illustrations. Children were handling these books more, and one of the dangers in that is, of course, that they will be damaged or soiled. So having such a lovely set of first editions, having them signed, and having them with the original pictorial dust jackets is really quite a lovely thing. And I think too, speaking of this progression and speaking of imagination and how children's sort of lives are addressed and handled through children's literature, what better than the 100-Acre Wood to really think of, a sort of other world that we can get lost in and learn lessons in. And the last thing that I want to speak about very briefly is another icon in children's literature, and that is The Little Engine That Could. So this was published in 1930, and as the title suggests, it's The Little Engine That Could, retold by Watty Piper from The Pony Engine by Mabel C. Bragg. So this is a story that has had kind of different iterations, but we have arrived at this version that we all know, we're all very familiar with, and the tagline, "I think I can," which I think has probably encouraged many children and adults alike. So in the midst of such an impressive collection that has all of these high points, I think that it's really endearing to see such an important array of children's literature as well that, again, sort of speaks to perhaps early formed habits of collection, and then also just the lessons that remain with us through literature.
Thank you, Kalika. Thanks, everyone. I enjoyed all of those other presentations. I do need to speak to my agent. She did get me on first, but only in a quarter of the screen. So everyone else got to fill off a little bit more. But that's all right. I've been here long enough. I can do. So we have a few questions coming in. And I'm going to take the first one, which was, how did the Littmans begin their collection of Americana and other books and manuscripts? And I think they began, as all collectors should. They began with an intrinsic interest. Mr. Littman, in particular, loved American history, and both of the Littmans were big readers, and they started off not as grand collectors, but on a modest scale. Mr. Littman early on met the great Chicago book dealer, Ralph Newman, and from Mr. Newman, he got some, pretty basic books, but presidential autobiographies, signed limited editions of some of the presidential autobiographies, Coolidge and Truman, some inscribed books by Jack Kennedy. And from that, he started to grow. He also got, undoubtedly from Ralph Newman, an amazing run of the limited editions club. From their golden period of 1929 up through 1957. This is a virtually complete set, and if you're familiar with these, they're beautifully made books. They're often signed by their designers or illustrators. So from that, I think, as Mr. Littman became more successful, he founded a security firm inspired by his father, who had been a private detective, essentially, Guardsmark, which became one of the most successful and largest private employers in the country. And as his means grew, he started to collect more important books, but it was all rooted in his love of history and their shared love of reading. Another question, which maybe I'll toss to Richard, is how are books preserved in a collection through decades and even through centuries?
Well, I think one of the things, if you're a new collector and you start seeing books with estimates in the thousands of dollars, how would I care for such a thing if I desired to own it? And that's actually, it's much easier than you would think. Books are actually pretty tough, especially when you start talking about books in the 18th century and before. The paper is much more akin to cloth than the paper we would think of it. Books are in leather bindings. Caring for a leather binding is not that difficult. It's no more difficult really than caring for a pair of shoes. Just oiling the bindings a little bit once in a while. I think the best advice I got for storing books is if you're comfortable in terms of heat, humidity, the climate, then the book should be comfortable. But one of the best ways to preserve books, particularly more modern books, and luckily I have something to show you right here, which are cases. Many of the books in the Littman collection come in these slip cases. And these not only look great on the shelf, you can see the title of the book, but it protects the book to the extent that it needs to be protected. But again, books aren't something to be overly concerned about handling. We often get asked, why shouldn't you be wearing white gloves? No, that's not something that we usually do. One of the great pleasures in books is actually the tactile sensation of it. And you don't have that if you're wearing white gloves. You don't need to worry, if your hands are clean, you don't need to worry about leaving smudges or making the book sturdy. So if you're thinking about collecting, don't let how you store the book stand in the way.
Thank you. That's all good advice, but don't oil those wrappers.
Yeah.
Another question about the Littmans is, what items did they particularly love? For Mrs. Littman, I think I'd have to guess a little bit, but I would say it's the books that Kalika was talking about, the children's books. The Littmans had 3 sons, and I have no doubt that Mrs. Littman, like many mothers and caregivers, loved to read to her boys when they were little. I know my wife did, and so I have to think that some of the books that Kalika spoke about and others that she didn't have time to like the wonderful collection of Bob R books were among her favorites. With Ira, there's no doubt. He had a book that was a textbook used by Nathan Hale, a schoolboy text of Cicero. And that was, I think, his great treasure. And it would make sense that someone involved in the security business would want a book that had belonged to a martyr spy, as Nathan Hale was. Another question, which I think maybe Richard will jump in on, but let's start with Ella, because Clemens was very involved in his own publications, and that is it unusual for an author to be so involved in the production of a book like Whitman was with Leaves of Grass? But let's start and turn that on Mark Twain.
Yeah, I mean, to my knowledge, and I welcome my colleagues' added input here, where Twain was deeply involved in, proofing the galleys and advising on the physical book, the extent to which Whitman was involved with the literal production of the book was somewhat noteworthy, in that he was setting the type himself. That is sort of a degree of involvement that you aren't necessarily going to see with a commercial production like with Twain. Richard, are you able to expand on that?
That's absolutely right. It's, when Whitman did it himself, he also did his own reviews. I mean, he did the promotion of the book as well. And what he would do is write his own reviews. Of course, they were all positive. Paste these into later editions of the book that would go out, because he was really much doing his own marketing as well. So he was essentially a one-man industry, all the way from, as you were saying, typesetting, proofing, choosing the binding, choosing the frontispiece, and then sending the copies out, trying to get attention for himself. And one of the great works of self-promotion is writing your own reviews and being able to get those in front of people as well. So he was incredibly involved with the production of Leaves of Grass. And I think that's one of the reasons that the first edition of Leaves of Grass resonates with people so much, is because you can really feel the author's hands all over these copies. There's every chance, well, there is, that he would have touched this copy of the book. There were only 337 in this binding. And as we know, he was setting the type over in Brooklyn in a basement printing shop. So for someone that has a personal connection to Leaves of Grass, to the work of the author, having a first edition where the author is so involved is even more resonant.
Well, I have to add a word or two about Clemens. His early books were published, as many books were at the time, by subscription. Salesmen would go around, you'd order a book, and a publisher would print it and deliver it. He always thought he was being ripped off by publishers. and he probably was, and he hated publishers. He hated proofreaders in particular, who always were trying to correct his vernacular and dialect. So he may not have set type, but he started his own publishing company. And when you see a book with the imprint of Charles Webster was Mark Twain's nephew by marriage. And he set him up publisher first to publish his own books, and they expanded, as was typical with Clemence's business sense. They overexpanded and eventually went bankrupt. He also lost his shirt, possibly literally, in investing in an early linotype machine called the Page typesetter. So I do think it was more common generally in the 19th century for authors to be involved. Let's have a question. This is a tough one for Kalika because it's the sort of question where you want to be sure. How rare is the first edition set of Pooh books?
Oh, that is a tough question. And I think that with modern first editions, the thing that really becomes the most important issue is condition. And so I think with something like this set, where we still have the dust jackets, they're still in relatively good condition, that really speaks to rarity as well. So with these, the sort of subsequent years, something that was printed in 1927, like Now We Are Six, would have had a larger print run, presumably, than something like When We Were Very Young, which was printed in 1924. So these numbers would have shifted. The publisher would have made adjustments as there was a better gauge of popularity and demand. So yes, I think much to Selby's point, it's kind of a difficult question, but I would say that condition is also a factor. And again, here we have all of those lovely dust jackets with the additions.
Right. That's what I would say, is that if you simply wanted a set of the 4 books, you could probably complete that this week by calling some booksellers. To find a set in comparable condition with the jackets and signed by Milne, you'd be looking a lot longer than a week.
Yes.
Well, one last question. How did the Littmans enjoy and share their collection? Richard, I know you were at the home, as I was. Do you have any remembrances of that?
I certainly do. Well, one of the ways that I think Ira enjoyed and shared the collection, certainly when we were in the library, he really enjoyed showing his books and telling the story of their acquisition. And also, Ira was someone who very much enjoyed the process of acquiring books, whether it was at auction or from dealers. The process of building a great library was part of the way that he and Barbara enjoyed the collection, certainly.
Yeah, they lived with their books. These things, even the most valuable things, were not kept in a bank vault. They were kept in the library on the shelf. And that's what I remember as well. Ira would like to know who your favorite historical figure was and show you something. And what I remember, Richard, from the first time you were there, the two of you discovered that you were from the same part of the world, Louisiana and Arkansas. And Mr. Littman was able to show you some early printings of Arkansas laws and Tennessee laws. And I remember that, and he loved to engage people with something that he himself was so engaged with.
Very true.
Well, I think that's all the time we have. So I want to thank Richard and Ella and Kalika, and I want to thank all of you for joining us. And I want to remind you that the sale is up now, and all of the items that we spoke about are described and illustrated there, as are scores and scores more that we didn't have time to get to. Sale is open. You can find it on the calendar at SOTHEBY'S.com through a week from tomorrow. Started to close at 2 p.m. on December 16th. Call us or email us for an appointment at the exhibition from the 12th through the 15th, or at another time if you can't make it then. So thank you for your questions. Thank you for your attention, and best of luck in your own collecting. Bye.